Hey everybody, and welcome back to video number 2 on the 5 pillars of wealth mastery. Alright, if you watched our last video, we talked all about wealth preservation. How do you get from point A to point B and preserve your wealth through all ebbs and flows and reaching your goals? Okay, now today we're going to go a little bit deeper in the second pillar. Now, I want you to think about building out to wealth mastery is like building a house. Okay, you look at, have you ever built a house or have ever watched somebody build a house or driven past a construction site? You start with the foundation and you build up. So last week, or in our last video, we talked exactly about the first layer, the foundation, which is how do you build and preserve your wealth. Now that we have that foundation, that baseline, we could take it to the next phase. So if you remember, just going to pull this up real quick. Hold on. We started with your goals, right? Now, the whole concept around everything you do, if you remember, this was the key takeaway in the last video. This transcends every pillar that we deal with. And within every pillar, every strategy. Every strategy that you encounter, the foundational piece is your goals. Your goals must be the driving force behind everything you do, right? Like if you just got in your car and just started driving around, you wouldn't go anywhere. You just wind up somewhere, just not where you want to go. You wouldn't get in the car without a destination. You wouldn't go on an airplane if you didn't know where you were going. You should not get involved in any type of financial strategy unless you know the destination. Will it put you in a position to achieve your goal? So getting that clear baseline, that foundational piece is crucial. Then we talked about wealth preservation, getting from point A to point B. I gave you the Mount Everest effect, right? You want to get to your goal at the summit. There's going to be some obstacles along the way. You reach the summit, but you got to get down. You got to distribute your wealth over time after you build up your mountain or your pool of capital, right? And then, what happens? How long are you going to live? How long do you need those distributions for? What issues might you run into along the way? And the reason why I call it the Mount Everest effect, if you remember, back in '96, there was a major tragedy with these hiking groups that they missed time getting to the summit and they didn't plan their descent. And it didn't end well for them. A lot of people unfortunately died on that expedition. And if you look back to all the expeditions climbing Mount Everest, the most people died on the descent. So wealth preservation is not just about reaching the summit, but reaching the summit and how do you live for the rest of your life so you don't have to worry about money and all the things that can happen, all the storms, the avalanches that could happen along the way. Now, today, now that we figured that out, we're going to talk about something that's, I think, really important. And the reason why it's so important is when you get to the summit and you're coming down, all of those storms, we need to figure out a way, how do we protect the wealth you've created? How do we protect it? I like you to think about this as you have this wealth, you have this income. Let's build a virtual wall. Or let me just pull up the screen here. Let's build a virtual wall or a virtual moat around your wealth so it's really protected. No matter who shows up in the picture, you are in control of your wealth. Now, this is pretty relevant for me because I think back to a situation that happened to my mom. Now, my mom hasn't, unfortunately, been with us for 19 years now. But when she was young, when she was, I think, 20 or 21, she was in a terrible auto accident and she was driving. And fortunately, nobody died, but some people got hurt. And my grandfather was the one that got sued. Now, this is like back in like the 1960s or something like that. And he was sued for like $1 million, which in today's dollars, that's just like, you wouldn't want to get sued for $1 million today. Think about it back in like the late 60s, what that would do to you. So basically, it destroyed my grandfather's financial situation. My mother, unfortunately, people had gotten better, but the lawsuit went through. They didn't win. Financially, he was finished. Ultimately, it drove him to a place that he had a heart attack. Now, he didn't die then, but he had a heart attack and was like disabled for a period of time, and he wasn't able to work for, I think, about 3 or 4 years. So income dried up, and my grandmother, in those days, I mean, she didn't work. She was a housewife. So the financial storm that hit my grandparents because of this accident was just earth-shattering. And so what we're going to talk about today is, I think, a very important thing, because no matter what stage you're at life, and let me be very clear, my grandparents were not even middle class. I mean, they were like lower, like they were struggling. They were immigrants, right? So when they came here, they were just fighting to make it like everybody else. So it doesn't matter what level of wealth you're at. Sure, if you're super rich and worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, you need multiple layers of insulation, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the more advanced strategies also. But even if you're just, building out your family, you have some income, maybe a few dollars you want to protect, something like what happened to my mom and my grandparents, that happens every day. Okay, so we're going to show you, how do we protect? How do you protect your wealth? How do you protect your income? So no matter who shows up in the picture, whether there's a lawsuit, whether it be unfounded or righteous or whatever, or it's something down the line, which I'll get into how that works, where you didn't even think about these things kind of showing up. This might be like a future ex-spouse of a child. And if they get divorced, and how that plays into it, and how your potential inheritance to your children could go away. So protecting your wealth now and in the future, no matter what happens, no matter who shows up in the picture, making it as tough as possible for creditors, potential creditors, to get to your hard-earned wealth. That's what we're going to dive into today. So let me just pull this back up. So let me actually blow this up for you here. Again, this starts with your goals. Everything starts with your goals. Wealth protection. All right. Now, the first step of this, if you look at this, is the basics. Now, the basics is really your homeowners, your auto insurance, and your umbrella. Now, if you don't own a home, if you say, Mike, look, we're renting, well, then it's not homeowners insurance, it's renters insurance, but the same rules apply. Okay, so here's the deal. These are just the three key things that you need. Now, what I've seen a lot of people is they don't have an umbrella policy, or if they have one, it's not the right amount, and there's some issues, and I'll get into that. They check the boxes between their homeowners and auto because they have to have it, and they'll simply shop on price and say, all right, I need homeowners, so just what's the best price, and they give me that. Well, guess what? You get what you pay for. There's many different elements to this. So things that you're going to want to think about when you're doing your homeowners or your renter's policy, you want to look into the details of the policy. Now, you don't have to read through the entire thing, because who's got the time? You go through what's called the declaration page. And there's a few key things that you want to look at. First and foremost is how much is covered for the content inside your house. Okay? Now, a lot of people have no clue how much all their stuff is worth. I have seen people that have multi-million-dollar homes with lots of stuff in it, that the contents, meaning that if everything burned up in a fire, like how much they would pay for your wardrobe, your furniture, your electronics, your computers, your phones, your silverware, right, your plates, your china, like all of that stuff. I've seen people with like unbelievable homes have contents of like $60,000 of coverage, when like their dining room table and chairs was probably around that. So because they were shopping on price, they were just trying to get a cheap price for it and not realizing what they were doing. And this is more common than not. So you want to look at that. You also want to look at loss of use. Right? So meanwhile, again, people will shop on price. Loss of use means if, like, let's say there was a flood or a fire, something where like you couldn't use your house for a period of time, or the apartment or the condo or wherever that you're living, and you had to go live in a hotel or rent something else, how much are they going to give you, and for how long? Now, this happens a lot. You'd be surprised. You may be thinking, well, Mike, listen, I live in a city, I live in an apartment building, like, what are the odds? Well, if the person above you has a leak and floods your apartment, it's going to happen. Or let's say there's a fire down the hall and there's smoke damage and you're out and it takes like a year for the city to get the right permits. So again, it's not just if you live in a home. If you live in an apartment or a condo, these things happen more so than not. So the loss of use is like, all right, how much do you have and is that enough? So I want you to think about that. Is that enough to cover if something goes wrong and you've got to move out for a period of time? Do you have enough money of coverage where you don't have to go into your investments and cannibalize them? Now this is where it comes together with the 5 pillars. You did everything right in pillar number 1, but if your wealth protection plan is wrong, you got to start cannibalizing all your good work. You wanted to retire in a certain period of time, you're saving money, you have the right investment strategy, you have all of those things going well for you. Something goes wrong with your homeowners and boom, you've got to carve out some money and now you've set yourself back sometimes a number of years. Okay, auto insurance, same type of, there's much more to that. I'm going to get through it in an exercise. I'm just giving you a high level now and then we'll go through an exercise. So something that you can take home and work through. So the next is auto insurance. You really want to look at your liability coverage, right? The liability coverage for, medical treatments. If you get into an accident, is it no fault? Meaning like if somebody hits you, how much you covered for, is that appropriate? Then you also want to look at replacement value if you own the car, not if you lease it. So let's say you bought a car for $50,000, but they're only going to give you replacement value of the car. And let's say it's 3 years after. Well, cars, unless you have like a Ferrari that goes up in value, basically the replacement value of a 3-year-old car might be half the cost. So you might not get the same level of car if, let's say, your car gets banged up or you can't use it and it's totaled or something like that. And the last is umbrella. Now, let me just go back to this here. I just want to talk to you here. The umbrella policy, also known as excess liability. This is one of the most overlooked components of someone's protection plan. And I will tell you this is probably the most cost-effective thing that you can do. What an umbrella policy does, if something happens where you are sued, whether you get into an auto accident, somebody slips and falls in your home, you're outside of your home, something that just goes wrong and you get sued for a lot of money that goes above and beyond the liability coverage in your home and auto, that's when an umbrella kicks in. Now, here's some things to think about. When you have an umbrella policy, let's say you had $1 million umbrella policy, meaning if you get sued for $1 million, and let's say you got into a car accident and the lawsuit was $1 million and they won the lawsuit against you. Basically, your auto insurance, let's say there was liability coverage for $250,000. If you didn't have an umbrella policy, the auto policy would pay the $250,000 and you would pay $750,000. With an umbrella policy, what happens is, ideally, the auto covers the first $250,000. From $251,000 to $1 million, the umbrella kicks in. And this way, you're insulated and you've built a wall around your wealth. Because if you didn't have that, what would happen is auto covers $250,000. You have to go back to pillar 1, and hopefully you have the $750,000. And if you don't have the $750,000, you're in even bigger trouble. So an umbrella policy is a really good thing to have. Now, think about how much of an umbrella do you need? Is $1 million enough? $5 million? 10? What's the number? The rule of thumb that I suggest is to have an understanding of your net worth and match the umbrella to that. So if your net worth is $10 million, guess what? You need a $10 million umbrella policy. If it's 20, 20. If it's $1 million, it's $1 million. Now you say, Mike, well, look, I'm not at $1 million yet. Well, you may say, well, look, I know if I'm not at $1 million yet and I only have $250,000 in auto or whatever the number is, you may want to get something around that just to have some level of reserve so there's not impending doom on future cash flows. So those are just the rules of thumb to think about. Now let me just pull this back up here. I want to go through a basic exercise with you. So this is really what you should do. All right. Now first and foremost is I want you to grab a pen and pad and jot this down. This is some homework for you. I want you to pull together all of your insurance policies. I want you to look at your homeowners. I want you to take a look at your auto insurance, and if you have an umbrella policy, look for that too. Now, when it comes to all of these policies, get what's called the declaration page. It's a one-sheeter, and it's going to detail your premium, all the parameters of like what they're covering, and what the deductible is. The deductible is like how much you have to pay before the insurance company will come in. Now, here's a really cool thing. This is just a bonus tip on this. When you have a deductible, you may want to think about your deductible of how much risk you personally will take on, because that actually impacts the cost of premium. The higher the deductible, the lower the premium. So if you want to generate some new cash flow, you may say, well, in my homeowner's policy, I have $1,000 deductible, which would say that you're on the hook for $1,000, and anything above that, the insurance company is on. Well, you may say, well, I want to not pay so much money in homeowner's premium. So basically you just lift the 1,000 to maybe 2,500, maybe 5,000, 10,000, 25,000. I mean, it really depends on how much risk you're taking on, and get an understanding of, well, if I lift it to this, what does my premium come down to? Okay. Same thing with auto coverage. How much risk do you want to take on? So have an understanding of all of the parameters that are in there. Now, in homeowners, detailed loss of use, liability, somebody slips and falls in your house, what kind of coverage is there? The contents, we talked about the contents. How much are you covered for? And does that seem right? And think about, take an inventory in your mind, the silverware, the furniture, the electronics, the wardrobe. If you have kids, the toys for the kids, all of their wardrobes, all of the stuff inside the house. Does it seem right? Do you need to increase that number? Right? Think about all those things. The deductible we talked about. Umbrella, we talked about, let me blow this up again so you can see it. We talked about having it ideally to equal your net worth. And are there any gaps? Now, here's a common issue I find when we evaluate people's insurance and we look at their basic insurance or wealth protection plan, is there's a potential gap in their umbrella policy. Now, if you remember, the umbrella policy works like this. Just highline, if you had $1 million umbrella policy and you got sued for $1 million, right? And because of, let's say, the car accident, the auto insurance liability covers $250. The umbrella covers the other $750. That's the $1 million. Okay. What we run into many, many times is the auto covers $250, but there's a caveat in the umbrella policy that only kicks in, and this is just the language you need to be aware of to make sure there's no gap. In some cases, we've seen that the auto's at $250 and the umbrella kicks in at $500, which would mean if there was $1 million lawsuit that you lost, auto gives you $250, you $250, and then $500 from the umbrella policy, which again, you go back to pillar number 1 and you have to cannibalize $250,000. So you want to make sure there's no gaps. You want to ensure that when you look at your umbrella, if you have it, right, that your umbrella kicks in when the liability coverage is exhausted in your homeowners, your renters, or your auto policy. There should be no gaps. No gaps. Okay, so that's the exercise. Take some time, grab a pen and paper, write that down, get the declaration page. I'm going to pull this back up for you. Get the declaration pages for homeowners. Understand what the loss of use is, meaning how much time, if you couldn't live there, how much money are they paying and how long would that last before you would have to actually go into your assets. Liability, this is if somebody slips and falls and gets hurt at your house. The contents, the stuff inside, and the deductible. This can actually help your premium costs. Umbrella policy, do you have one? Is it equal to your net worth? Are there any gaps? Okay, so that is really the first step in protecting your assets. in what I call building a virtual moat or building a virtual wall around your wealth. Now, if you remember, the situation that went on with my mom and my grandfather is that, he had a heart attack and he was out of work for a period of time. So not only did the lawsuit totally destroy them, but he wasn't able to go out and work and earn income. So now we have the foundational piece that we talked about. We're going to talk about the next level. Right? It's not really advanced. It's still pretty generic stuff, but the basics is home, auto, umbrella. Now we're going to go into the next, which is how to protect your income and how do you protect your assets even more. So let me just pull this up here. Okay, so building building a virtual moat around your wealth, step 2, it's really 3 components that you need to be concerned about. Disability, life, and long-term care. Now here's the deal. It's like my grandfather, right? He wasn't able to work for a number of years, meaning there was no income coming in. How do you pay the bills? Well, guess what? It's the same type of thing. If you got injured, and again, this doesn't mean that you have to have a long-term injury. You could just be out of commission for a couple of years. That can be devastating. And what can happen is you then have to go back to pillar 1 and you have to start cannibalizing the assets that you've worked hard and saved for to bridge the gap. So one way to address this is to transfer the risk that you or your spouse will have some type of injury or disability that would put you out of work, whether it be short-term or long-term, to ensure that there is no change in the income so your family can maintain their quality of life. So you with me so far on this? All right, this is pretty straightforward stuff. This is all about making sure that the mortgage is paid, food is in the fridge, right? The kids' school is paid for, the camps are paid for, they have clothes to wear. So there's consistency, continuity of your income if you're not able to earn your income. So disability protection planning is crucial, especially if you're low on assets. If you're really high on assets, you may or may not want it. It's really up to you. And you'd have to look into it. If you're worth $500 million, you may not need disability insurance. But if you're like everybody else, which is you're doing well and you're working hard, but if you were out of commission, you couldn't earn income, it would be devastating. So it's something that really everybody should be looking at, whether you're an entrepreneur, you have a young family, an older family. If you want to protect your income, disability protection is something that really should be looked at. Second is life insurance. Now, life insurance is really a strategy, a tool that helps with 2 things. The first is if something happened to you or something happened to your spouse. Now, aside from the emotional damage that would have to your family, the financial impact of not having you around, how does your family survive? So it's something that you need to think about. If you have, I have a young family. I'm married, fortunately, with 3 wonderful kids. They're all young. If I wasn't here to provide, if I wasn't here, and we're a dual income, my wife works as well, but it takes a village, right? So if we weren't both here, it would be challenging. So we have a pool of capital in an insurance policy, whereas if something should happen to me or something should happen to my wife, yes, they would be my wife might not be so upset, but the kids would be really upset. But the reality is this, that there would be assets protected to maintain the quality of life, that the family doesn't have to move out of the house. The kids can still go to school. They can still go to camp. They could still save for college. They can still do all the things that they need to do from a financial standpoint. So I want you to think about if something happened to you, or if you're married, something happened to your spouse, aside from the emotionals, which, obviously that's a totally different animal, from a financial standpoint, what would you do? Could you survive? Would you have to make some tough decisions and move and change the quality of your life? And that's really what the first component of life insurance is about. The second is really for estate planning, which we're going to get into in one of the other pillars, but a big culprit against your wealth and protecting it is taxes. And estate taxes at certain levels can become disastrous to a family's legacy. And so certain types of life insurance strategies can be put into place to really insulate the family's wealth against potential estate taxes. Now, we're going to talk about that in much more detail in a future pillar, but I wanted to give you two really key reasons of why life insurance is a crucial component of wealth protection. Now, I just want to pause. Something that you're going to see a lot of, let me just blow that up here. Something that you're going to see a lot of in the 5 pillars of mastering your wealth, there's a lot of overlap and cross-pollination. You see, like, you do everything right in pillar 1, but you don't address pillar 2, pillar 1 breaks. Right? Part of protection planning dives into another pillar, which is more about legacy and estate planning, and you need to look at them hand in hand, which we'll get into. So this is like when, again, you're building your financial house. You have the foundation, which is your goals, but if you just build one wall and you have a second wall and the second wall falls, it can knock the first wall over. So you need to be making sure all of these pillars are working cohesively, and I'm going to show you how to do that. I just wanted to pause and bring it up because I thought it was a good idea to do. All right, so let's bring this back. All right, the last component of the second step in building a virtual moat around your wealth is long-term care. Now, this is like age dependent, and a lot of people have a lot of questions around this. So basically, all this means is if you or your spouse, or if you have parents that are a little bit older that you're going to be financially responsible for, have some type of illness that they need some care. And I'll give you an example. So my father has been remarried, and my father's sister-in-law has been struggling with some, as she's getting older, and she's struggling with some dementia, Alzheimer's, and it's a very sticky situation. Now, she's a young woman. She's in her early 70s, and she's physically healthy, but she's struggling with these terrible diseases, and she needs round-the-clock care, right? She has to be in one of these facilities that, costs a fortune. These facilities run, depending upon where you live in the country, anywhere from $80,000 to $120,000 today. So I want you to think about this. If you have family that you're going to be financially responsible for, all right? If not, you're going to have to be financially responsible for yourself and your spouse, or vice versa. And basically, you want to think about when, and this is not really if we live to 95, 100, there's a pretty high probability that something's going to happen that you need some level of nursing care. We just don't know at one point. We don't know if it happens when you're 70, 80, 90, but at some point, most likely, there's going to be some level of nursing care. I mean, even if you were like 85 and you shattered a hip, you probably need some help for a year or two. That's just the way it goes. And so the idea to think about is, all right, if it's 100, 120,000 today, think about how much that's going to be in the future because the cost of living, right? Remember, from pillar 1, we have to keep up our buying power. Well, the same thing, if a cup of coffee at Starbucks is growing, every year, and I'm drinking the same cup and it's just costing more and more, think about nursing care, how much that's going to be growing. So think about, even if it was now, and you had to spend $100,000 per year, and it was 3 or 4 years that you had to spend in a nursing home. Do you want to use your assets to pay for that? Right? Or do you want to transfer the risk somewhere else? Now, there's a lot of ways to do that. There's ways in the wealth protection area that you can address and transfer the risk of this potential cost to an insurance company. There's no one way that's better than the other. It's really dependent on your situation, depending on cash flow, where you live, and also family history. So those are some things that you want to think about. And those are really the 3 components of the second phase of building out your wealth protection plan. Now, I'm going to go through a quick exercise with you so you can just write this down to see what really relates to you in your world and see how you can further insulate yourself against any of these potential issues. And these are challenging issues that come up unfortunately, more often than not. Let me just pull this up here. All right. So an exercise here, hopefully you can see this. I'm blowing this up here. I want you to take a moment and I want you to write a couple things down. So first, you should know what your income is because we talked about your cash flow in the first video in wealth preservation. understanding what your income and expenses are. So when you have an understanding of your income, we know what you're protecting. Now let me just blow this back up here. Now I want you to think about this and really give this some thought. If you know, it may even make sense to pause the video now and say, all right, your income is a certain amount. Let's say your income is $250,000. I want you to take a minute and really think through, if something were to happen to you and your family could no longer depend on this income, what would happen? Right? How would your family survive? And really think on that, journal about it. And then once you've done that, I want you to think about, if let's just say something happened to you where you passed away or your spouse passed away. And again, you weren't there. Aside from the emotions, from a financial perspective, what would your family do? How would they be able to survive? Would they be able to maintain the same quality of life from a financial standpoint? Or would there be some tough decisions? And I want you to journal about that. Just jot that down. And then lastly, I want you to think about this. When you're elderly, or if you have family that's elderly that you're going to be financially responsible for, I want you to think about, if you or the family you're responsible for needs care, and let's just say hypothetically the care is $100,000 a year, how will you pay for it? Okay? How will you pay for it? And if it's you that needs the care, do you want to use the assets from pillar 1 that you've worked your entire life to build to pay for this? That's called self-insuring. All right? Now here's the deal. If you feel uncomfortable with the answers to those questions, totally normal, you're human. I feel uncomfortable just thinking about them as I'm saying them and thinking of my own world, like, do I have, like, I want to revisit my protection plan to make sure I'm insulated, because just the thought of, you know, my family not being in a position to just do what they love to do and enjoy their life and have the opportunities that are afforded to them because I'm not in the picture anymore, or my wife's not in the picture anymore, is devastating to me. So think through that. And there's really no right or wrong answer, but if you're concerned about the answers to those questions, you want to look into your wealth protection plan a little bit deeper to make sure that you have the right components in place. And just because you have something in place doesn't mean it's right. Right? It's like, I go back to, that's why you want to look at these things to make sure they're going to land for you. I give the example, I have 3 young kids. A great solution or strategy for a sports car is like a Porsche or a Ferrari. I need a minivan, right? If I came home with that, my wife would kill me. So at some point when the kids are older, totally different ball games. So same type of thing when you're looking at your plan. A lot of people will do this piecemeal. They'll have some disability, maybe some through work. Maybe they picked up an insurance policy years ago, or they don't think they'll ever need nursing care, and it's a mishmash. So even if you have stuff, it's a good start. Want to look at it a little bit deeper. Is it right? Is it fitting your world, given what you need? And that's the second phase. Now let's just pull this up here, and we're going to go into the third phase. And this is, like I said earlier, we're going to go into more advanced planning. So I talked earlier about the baseline, the foundational pieces, the basics everybody needs. Then we just went up a little bit. Now we're talking more advanced, more esoteric strategies. So this is the third step, and this is not for everybody. Okay, a lot of these things are for the wealthier end of the spectrum, the super rich, and really business owners as well. But the first one really can work for most people at a modest to a very extreme level of wealth, is certain types of trusts. So by having your assets inside a certain type of trust, which we'll get into a little bit more in one of the other pillars, in essence, the idea of really becoming wealthy, like really wealthy, is to own nothing but control everything. And by having assets into a certain type of trust, which we'll get into at another pillar, in essence, what happens is you still have full control over it. Like, let's say you put your house in a trust that you can live in, but the trust owns it. And the trust pretty much wraps a level of creditor protection against it. So if something should happen to you, right? Let's say, let me give you an example here. Let's say you wanted to put your house in a trust. All right. Before you put your house in a trust, something happens to you, you pass away. And let's say you owned the house in joint name with your spouse. Now your spouse owns the house outright. Let's say a few years later, your spouse gets remarried. All right, so let's just make this reality. So my wife's Giselle. Let's say I got hit by a bus. All right, I'm sure she'd be emotionally distraught. A week later, let's say she's happy again. So a few years later, let's just say she gets remarried to Jim. And the house is owned in Giselle's name now because I never put it in. Let's just say I never put it in a trust. And she's married to Jim. And let's say that Jim doesn't like my children for whatever reason. I think they're great, but I'm biased. Let's say Jim's not a kid guy. He doesn't like kids, but he likes my wife. So let's just say at that point, something then happens to Giselle. Well, guess what? If Giselle did no planning after my death, which might happen, Jim owns the house. What do you think is going to happen to my kids? Jim doesn't like my kids. Then my kids are in a bad situation. So basically, by just the idea of insulating against, remember what I said earlier, no matter who shows up in the picture, now or in the future, Jim is in the future. I hope not, but like, if Jim in the future comes and, you know, the worst happens, if the house was in a trust by Jim, the house is for the kids. Okay? And a trustee would be appointed, so on and so forth. So that's the power with moving assets in the trust. You still control it, still live them, still use them, the whole thing, but it puts that layer of protection, like I say, building that virtual moat or that virtual wall around your wealth. So no matter who shows up in the picture, now or in the future, your assets are protected for you and your loved ones. Now, I'm just going to touch on these two more really advanced strategies. This is really more for business owners. So business owners, if you're watching, this is the time to really pay attention. One has to do with captive insurance companies. This is really esoteric, and this is not right for every business owner. But basically, if you have high insurance costs, workers' comp, health insurance, general liability, directors and officers, errors and omissions, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. If you have substantial costs and you have low claims, potentially a captive insurance company would allow you to keep a lot of the assets, a lot of the costs that you're spending to insurance companies really for you. And pretty much the way that it works is you establish what's called a captive insurance company, which is set up for the sole purpose of insuring the risks of the parent company. So for example, let's say your company is Company A, and Company A is spending $1 million a year on insurance costs. You have 100 employees, you have factories, you have all this stuff, and between everything, let's just say your costs are $1 million a year. And you're paying the insurance company $1 million. You get $1 million deduction on your taxes because it's a business expense. And if the worst happens, you're protected. Okay. So what a captive does, it pretty much gives you the exact same level of protection that you have now. But here's the deal. You set up a captive, right? The captive, you fund the captive with, instead of paying the $1 million to the insurance companies, you fund a portion of that $1 million to the captive. Maybe it's $800,000. Now, if something goes wrong, the captive is going to cover that. Now, why 800? Well, maybe you're going to want catastrophic coverage where, let's just say the worst happens and it's above, what you're currently covered for. You juice up the deductibles in traditional insurance, and maybe that costs you $200,000 or $300,000 a year, and those are your traditional carriers. And basically what happens is this. If, let's say, you're out of pocket $1 million, you spent $200,000 to the traditional carriers, and you had $800,000 in the captive. You with me so far? Okay, so same $1 million out of pocket, $200,000 traditional, $800,000 sitting in the captive. Okay, now let's say the claims throughout the year were $300,000. Okay, so the captive pays $300,000. You paid $200,000 to traditional services, so basically you paid out that you're not getting back $500,000. You have now a reserve of $500,000 in the captive that you didn't have to use because you paid the traditional insurance, you paid the claims, the $500,000 sitting in reserves, that's yours. And you can put that in T-bills, stocks, bonds. You can use it for future claims, whatever you want to do. It's a pretty cool strategy. Now, it's not right for everybody. And basically what you need to do is you have to run what's called a feasibility study. A feasibility study is really straightforward. It takes a look at your numbers, your business numbers, the types of insurance that you have, the premiums, your claims history, and it looks at it to say, well, would this work for you? And if so, what would it mean? Now, if you had high claims rates, like let's say your claims were like 60%, so like 600,000 out of the million, like you may not want to do it because the delta is not enough. So it's something that you might like the idea. You might say, that sounds great. It's really interesting. But the reality is this, until you look at it with your numbers, it could be the greatest strategy possible, right? Like the Ferrari, great strategy. I need a minivan. So great strategy, but it might not be right for you. The way to understand if it is right for you is a feasibility study. We'll talk a little bit more about that in some future videos. But for right now, it's just one strategy that really helps with protection planning and wealth building, because that can help with pillar number 1 too. And then lastly, this is pretty interesting, is a strategy called equity stripping. And this is really for business owners that want to protect against creditors if they think there's like an unjust lawsuit that's coming. In essence, if you have a business, you can take out some bank loans against like equipment or real estate. And basically, if there's an unfounded lawsuit, the creditors would have to pay off the bank loans first. The reality is it's going to be really tough for them to get at your assets. So that's it's a little bit more esoteric. Again, not right for everybody, but it is a pretty interesting strategy that a lot of super rich, wealthy people use from time to time. So that's the third step. Let me just pull that back up so you can see it. The third step around building a virtual moat or a virtual wall around your wealth. Again, certain types of trusts. Again, with trusts, it's own nothing, control everything. Captive insurance can be really powerful, but beware of your claims history and run a feasibility study. Equity stripping, not for everybody, but it does tend to be a powerful strategy when it works. Now, the one takeaway I want to leave you with is when you think about building a moat, or what I call a virtual moat around your wealth, it's really just to ensure that your wealth is protected and that you are always in control. All right, no matter what happens, you are always in control of your money, no matter who shows up, whether it's now or in the future. So I hope this message has served you. Now, I want you to stay tuned for next week, and I'm going to show you this right now. Our next video, what I want you to look at, we're going to be talking about something called wealth enhancement. All right, wealth enhancement is the third pillar of mastering your wealth. We talked about how you preserve your wealth, right? We talked about how you protect your wealth, which we just went through today. Now we're talking about how do we boost your net worth, right? We're getting the foundational pieces. Remember, we're thinking about building the house. We got the goals. We got from point A to point B. We built our moat. Now how do we really boost it and move the needle and get from point A to point B even faster? So stay tuned for the next video. It's going to be coming at you pretty soon. I hope this message has served you. I hope you got a lot out of it. I hope you learned some new insights and gained some new perspective. And I want you to think and make good, smart decisions around your money so you're able to achieve your financial goals. And by doing that, improve your quality of life. I'm Michael Gold. Make it a great day.